The moment was not prophecy. It was geometry. Mace Windu had spent a lifetime learning the angles by which violence revealed the truth of a soul. Vapad was not simply speed or fury, though men who had never stood before it mistook it for both. It was a storm with rules. It drank darkness, turned it, and returned it purified into judgment. In that blinding chamber, with Corasont burning below the windows like a bed of forged coals, he saw at last the point where the whole edifice cracked. It lay not in law, nor in evidence, nor in the orderly shape of an arrest. It lay in the old man on the floor, whose voice could move armies and whose smile, even burned by his own lightning, still carried the insolence of a monarch certain of history. Palpatine screamed and pleaded and lied all at once. Lightning boiled around Mace's blade in blue-white torrents. Black silk smoked. The handsome public face had sloughed away, or perhaps it had never existed. What remained was yellow-eyed age and ruin and delight. Delight more than pain. Delight because he understood, even then, what Mace was being forced to become. "No!" Anakin cried from the doorway, the word cracking with terror. "I need him." Mace struck. The purple blade went through black cloth, through flesh gone rigid with the dark side, through the lie of weakness and the greater lie of surrender. Palpatine's body jerked once, twice, and folded backward against the ruined sill. The lightning ceased. What remained was silence, the hiss of cooling metal, and the endless urban breath of the capital beyond the glass. Anakin Skywalker stopped 3 paces inside the office and stared as if he had arrived at the scene of his own execution. His hand hovered over his lightsaber without drawing it. His face, usually so open in anger or affection, had gone white and empty. He looked from the corpse to Mace and back again. Beneath the smell of ozone was the sharper odor of charred fabric and cooked skin, and it turned the room from battlefield into morgue in a single heartbeat. "You killed him," Anakin said. Mace's right arm trembled from the damage the lightning had done. He lowered his blade but did not release it. "I ended a Sith Lord. He was defeated. He was unarmed. And he had the Senate, the courts, the army, and every fear in this republic wound around his fingers. Do not speak to me of what he was." The younger man took another step, all but stumbling, and then dropped to one knee beside the corpse. The dead face seemed to mock him even in stillness. This was the man who had leaned close and whispered of unnatural abilities, who had spoken of saving life as if death itself could be bargained with, delayed, cheated, subdued. Anakin's gloved hand shook as it hovered over Palpatine's ruined robe. There was no answer there. No secret. No bargain left to make. Mace saw the truth arrive in him and failed to settle. Palpatine dead did not free Anakin from fear. It only severed fear from the one man who had promised to feed it. That was always the danger. A lie could die and still leave hunger behind. The office doors thundered under impact. Outside, voices rose in confusion. Red Guard pikes hammered at the sealed entry. Mace crossed to the Chancellor's desk and forced it open with the force. Hidden compartments answered his will. A thin hollow projector glowed to life, its last transmission frozen in static long enough to show the angular faceplate of General Grievous waiting for orders. Another cylinder dropped into Mace's hand, warm from recent use. On its polished side was the private seal reserved for supreme wartime channels. He clipped it to his belt. Anakin rose slowly. "You knew," he said, but he was speaking more to himself than to Mace. "You knew he'd never teach me. I knew he would teach you nothing except how to kneel." The answer hit harder than a blow. Anakin turned away. Through the broken pane, Coruscant spread beneath them in endless tiers of silver traffic and cold stars reflected in steel. The city seemed impossibly calm for a place that had just lost its ruler and nearly gained a tyrant of a different kind. Mace thumbed his comlink. "Temple security. This is Master Windu. Seal the high archives. Lock down the council spire. No one enters the Chancellor's office without my authority. Send immediate recall codes to Master Yoda on Kashyyyk and Obi-Wan Kenobi on Utapau. Priority black." The reply came in a burst of static and alarmed assent. Behind the doors, Masameda's shrill voice rose above the pounding. The Grand Vizier sounded half frantic, half enraged. Mace turned back to Anakin. There was no time for gentleness, but there was even less time for cruelty. Whatever he planted in you, Skywalker, do not water it tonight. Anakin's mouth tightened. You don't know what he promised me. No, but I know what he promises everyone. Mace extinguished his saber. Leave. Go where the cameras do not. If you have anyone you trust, keep them close. Before dawn, the whole city will be told a story about what happened here. We are already inside it. Nay. For an instant, Anakin looked as though he might draw on him anyway. Not in allegiance to Palpatine, but in naked grief, in the wounded instinct that lashes out at the nearest witness. Then the instinct passed. He gave one long look to the body at the window, to the man who had manipulated him, praised him, studied the weaknesses in him like a jeweler examining flaws in a gem. Then he turned and strode toward the private exit passage Mace had exposed behind a panel of carved stone. Mace waited until he was gone. Alone in the office with the dead Sith, he allowed himself one breath of exhausted disgust. He had wanted arrests, charges, something that could stand inside the Republic's own language and survive it. Instead, he had killed the head of state in his own chambers because the Republic had been converted, layer by lawful layer, into armor for a single monster. Palpatine had died with the expression of a man who had already planted the mine and no longer needed to survive the blast. By the time Mace entered the private transit shaft and began his descent into the hidden arteries beneath the Senate district, alarms were already climbing from tower to tower. On 1,000 screens across the Capitol, the first hurried reports were taking shape in studio mouths. Supreme Chancellor attacked. Jedi Masters in the executive chambers. Security lockdown. Unconfirmed fatality. Corasont did not mourn as one body. It never had. It chose its truths by district, by party, by fear. But all night long the city leaned toward one conclusion with the speed of falling metal. The Jedi had gone for the throne. The temple received Mace like a blade returning to its sheath with blood still on it. The high halls, built for contemplation and ceremony, had changed their nature by the time he crossed them. Guards stood at every major arch. Temple workers hurried younglings toward lower classrooms, with the careful calm adults use when they are trying not to pass panic from hand to hand. Shakti met him at the threshold of the council chamber, her expression going from relief to grim understanding as soon as she saw the burns creeping black beneath the cuff of his robe. He was the one, she said. Mace set the data cylinders on the central table. He was Sidious. The room seemed to contract around the name. Sindralig, called from the training halls, closed his eyes once as if listening for a wound opening in the Force. Jocasta Nu, who had insisted on coming despite the late hour, stood rigid beside the archives terminal with her hands clasped so tightly they trembled. And Skywalker? Shakti asked. He knows. That is not the same as standing with us. No, Mace said. It isn't. They moved with the forced precision of people who understood that delay would kill them more surely than any blade. Mace played the recovered fragments. The image of Grievous flared above the table and vanished into static. Another transmission gave them a cloaked silhouette, Palpatine's own voice passing encrypted fleet movements to a Separatist channel. It was not enough to win the Senate at first glance, but it was enough to confirm the shape of the betrayal beyond any private doubt. Recall Yoda, Mace said. Recall Obi-Wan Kenobi. Lock every archive related to contingency protocols, clone command authorization, and wartime executive privileges. If we are right about how deep this goes, he did not prepare only one move. While the temple reconfigured itself around crisis, Anakin crossed the city in a transport lane that looked serene from a distance and felt violent from within. Every vessel in the stream reflected other vessels in its hull, so that he seemed to be flying through endless ghost versions of himself, each one arriving too late. He did not remember docking. He only remembered the apartment doors opening and Padmé Amidala, standing there in pale lamplight with one hand at the small of her back, the other resting unconsciously beneath the curve of her pregnancy. She took one look at his face and reached for him without asking permission. He folded toward her more than embraced her, as if some hidden column inside him had split. "He's dead," he said into her shoulder. "Who?" "Palpatine." The name came out raw. "Mace killed him. He was Sidious. He was everything." Padmé pulled back just enough to search his face. Shock widened her eyes, but it was not surprise alone. It was the recognition of countless moments snapping into new alignment. The war powers, the convenient emergencies, the way Palpatine had always been nearest to Anakin when Anakin was most uncertain. "You told them?" "I told Mace he was the Sith we were hunting." He laughed once, without humor. "And then I arrived in time to watch the only man who said he could save you die on a Jedi blade. There it was, the center of it. The shame he could not disguise because before her, there was no disguise worth keeping." Padmé pressed his scorched fingers between her own. "Listen to me. I am here. For now. For now is all anyone ever has. That isn't enough. It has to be." Her voice gentled, not with softness but with resolve. "Ani, if he needed your fear to make his promise sound true, then it was never a promise. It was bait." He looked away. Outside the apartment, towers blazed with emergency beacons. 1,000 vehicles stitched bright lines through the air, restless and directionless at once. He had imagined victory over the Sith so many times in the abstract, and never once had he imagined this. Not triumph, not relief, only vacuum and the sudden realization that the future he feared had not been solved at all, merely stripped of the one person who claimed to command it. The holoscreen flickered. Mazameda appeared in formal mourning robes, his horns silhouetted against the seal of the Republic. His voice shook with practiced grief. "Citizens of the Republic," he said, "it is my solemn duty to inform you that Supreme Chancellor Palpatine has been murdered this evening during a violent assault by members of the Jedi Order. Security measures are now in effect throughout the Senate District and adjacent sectors. All citizens are urged to remain calm and comply with military directives while the full extent of this treason is investigated." Padmé's grip on Anakin tightened. Treason. The word had been waiting in somebody's throat for years. It came too quickly to be improvised. On the lower edge of the broadcast crawled images of clone shock troopers establishing cordons around government towers. No accusation had yet named Mace, but the shape of the lie was already complete. The Jedi had come armed into the Chancellor's chambers. The Chancellor was dead. Therefore the Jedi had attempted a coup. "He was ready," Padmé whispered. "Even for this." "Of course he was." She straightened. The senator replaced the wife in her, not because the wife vanished, but because love sharpened duty instead of diminishing it. Leia will see it for what it is. Mon too. There are others. Nay. Anakin almost laughed again. Others who can stop a dead chancellor from becoming a martyr? Others who can stop fear from voting itself into a crown. She moved to the comm terminal. "If the story settles before morning, we lose the chamber. If we lose the chamber, then every clone in the army is somebody else's argument." He did not want her stepping into the fire. He wanted to lock every door and keep her beyond the reach of history. The thought arrived so naturally that it frightened him more than any nightmare. He watched her contact Bail Organa's residence, then Mon Mothma's, then half a dozen private channels reserved for senators who still remembered what emergency powers had cost them. She did it with one hand on her belly, an iron in her spine. On Kashyyyk, Yoda paused in the midst of a military briefing and turned his face toward a sky full of green-gold dusk. The Wookiee commanders fell silent. He felt not only the extinguishing of a great dark fire, but the savage recoil that followed it, like vacuum rushing to fill a chamber where poison had burned. The clones near him did not raise weapons. They watched him with ordinary concern, and that ordinary concern chilled him. So narrow, then, the edge had been. "Return to Corasont I must," he said. Tarful bowed his enormous head. "War follows you there?" Yoda closed his eyes. "Always there it was. On Utapau, Obi-Wan Kenobi was halfway down the sinkhole city with blaster fire cracking around him when the coded recall reached his comlink. He caught only fragments between impact and movement. Black priority, Chancellor compromised, return when able. There was no time to decode more. General Grievous still lived, and as long as Grievous lived, the Separatist army had a blade in its fist. Obi-Wan slid the comlink back into place, mounted Boga, and rode deeper into the city with the taste of dread settling cold at the back of his throat. That night, while the temple sealed itself and senators woke their allies and every newsfeed in the capital found fresh ways to say the word treason, Anakin lay awake beside Padmé without sleeping at all. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Palpatine not as a corpse, but as a possibility cut off. Each time he opened them, he saw Padmé breathing, and thought how fragile breath looked in the dark. By the time dawn touched the uppermost towers of Corasont, Obi-Wan had killed Grievous with a scavenged blaster and an apology to civilization. The battle on Utapau had the strange unreality of a dream occurring in parallel to a larger nightmare. Boga screamed beneath him. Grievous skittered across stone like some obscene thing born for caves and slaughter, and all the while the coded recall pressed at the edge of Obi-Wan's attention. Something had broken at the center of the Republic. He knew it with the same certainty with which he knew where Grievous would leap next. When the cyborg general finally split open under blaster fire, blue-white flame consuming the organs caged in metal ribs, Obi-Wan stood panting in the dust and felt no triumph at all. Commander Cody met him at the landing platform with the half-smile of a soldier relieved to see an impossible plan somehow survive first contact. "You did it, General." "For a value of did that may not last a day," Obi-Wan said. Cody's brow furrowed. "Sir?" Obi-Wan handed him the comlink. Cody scanned the recall code and went still. "That's temple priority. Set course for Coruscant as soon as our people are stable." Obi-Wan swung up the transport ramp. "And Cody, until we know more, trust nothing that arrives without full authentication." "Nothing." Something in his tone forbade questions. Cody only nodded and turned to bark orders. The simple loyalty of it struck Obi-Wan harder than the warning itself. In another possible future, perhaps in the same narrow hour from which they had just emerged, those same men might have turned on him at a word. The thought passed like a cold hand over the spine. Yoda returned to the temple, not as a conquering sage, but as a witness summoned to a funeral that had not yet decided what it was burying. When he entered the council chamber, Mace did not rise. He stood already, rigid with fatigue and consequence. Palpatine's recovered data cylinders arrayed before him like artifacts from a plague house. "Tell me," Yoda said. Mace did. Not defensively. Not proudly. He gave the facts with the severe honesty of a man who knew that one unjustified word now would rot everything. Palpatine's confession. The duel. Anakin's arrival. The shatterpoint he had seen in the Force. The decision to kill. When he finished, silence sat in the chamber like an additional counselor. "At the last," Yoda said, "a prison of his own making, the law had become." Mace inclined his head once. "Yes. And Skywalker. Angry. Afraid. Not lost." Yoda's ears lowered slightly. "The distance between, short it can be." Anakin was summoned soon after. He came in wearing the same tunic from the night before, his hair uncombed, his eyes rimmed in sleepless red. He did not look like a champion of the Republic. He looked like a young man who had discovered that a fatherly hand on his shoulder had always been measuring his neck. Yoda let the silence receive him before speaking. "Confess himself, did the Chancellor?" Anakin's jaw flexed. "Yes." "Asked Sidious?" "Yes." "And promised he power over death." That struck home. Anakin's gaze snapped to Mace, then back to Yoda, and for a heartbeat, naked alarm moved through him. He said there were ways the Jedi didn't know. "There are many ways the Jedi do not know," Yoda said. "Not all of them truth." Anakin's hands curled at his sides. "That doesn't make the people we lose any less dead." No one answered at once. Mace could feel the whole chamber choosing restraint around him. This, he thought, was what they had so often failed to do with Skywalker. Not discipline, not flatter, not fear, but wait long enough to hear the wound beneath the anger. At last Yoda said, "Much fear in you there is still. And you're telling me that because you want to help me? Because help you, truth may. Lies never." Before more could be said, the outer security channel chimed. Shaak Ti answered it, and projected the feed into the chamber. Commander Fox stood at the temple gates in full Corasont guard armor, crimson stripes stark against white plastic. Behind him, rows of shock troopers formed clean hard lines across the broad processional stairs. Civilian crowds churned beyond the cordon, gathering wherever power scented blood. Fox's voice came clipped and formal. "By authority of Acting Executive Administrator Mace Windu, the Jedi Temple is placed under temporary security restriction pending Senate inquiry. No armed personnel are to leave the grounds. A delegation is requested to present itself for service of a warrant concerning the death of Chancellor Palpatine." Aye. Mace stepped to the hollow. "On what charge?" "Suspicion of treason, conspiracy, and unlawful use of force against the head of government." The words rang with the ugliness of being legally prepared in advance. Fox's face gave away nothing, but Mace could hear strain beneath the discipline. The commander was a soldier, not a politician. He had been handed a script and told to stand inside it. "The temple will receive a lawful Senate delegation," Mace said, "but no military force enters these grounds. Master Windu, I have orders. And I have responsibilities that predate your office by 1,000 generations." Fox's eyes flicked briefly aside, perhaps toward an unseen adjutant, perhaps toward the crowd. "Then I advise you not to test whether the city knows the difference." The transmission cut. From a high balcony beyond the chamber, the distant murmur of assembled civilians drifted inward like surf. Some shouted for justice. Some shouted for Palpatine. Some shouted only because history was happening nearby and they wished to feel it on their tongues. The temple, for all its serenity, had never truly belonged to Coruscant's ordinary rhythms. It had stood above them, admired or resented according to the season. Now the city was pressing back. Obi-Wan reached orbit 2 hours later, looked down through the forward viewport at the capital's crowded light, and felt the same thing one feels arriving at a home where all the windows are bright for the wrong reason. The Senate heard truth the way palaces hear thunder, as weather, not warning. By mid-morning, the great rotunda had filled with the rustle of robes, the flash of private whisper comms, the predatory stillness of beings who understood that governments can change shape in a single session if the fear is properly staged. Pods hovered in layered circles beneath the Chancellor's empty platform. It had been draped in black and gold so quickly the cloth still showed fold marks. Palpatine's absence occupied the chamber more completely than his body ever had. Bail Organa met the Jedi delegation at a restricted access port below the public galleries. His face was drawn but steady. "The chamber is split," he said quietly as they moved. "Some will hear you. Many more are waiting to see which way the floor tilts." "Mass?" Padmé asked from the far side of the corridor. She had joined them without announcement, wrapped in severe dark fabric that made her seem less a senator than a fragment of morning come alive. "Playing the dutiful servant," Bail said. "He calls only for process, only for calm, only for a lawful inquiry. Which is to say he calls for time enough to salt the earth." "No, they..." Padmé's eyes went briefly to Anakin and then away again before anyone else could mark it. "Then let's give the chamber less time than it wants." Mace Windu opened the session with measured sorrow. He spoke of service, loss, unity, stability. He spoke of the Chancellor as the Republic's faithful steward cut down by fanaticism. Then, with exquisite reluctance, he authorized the display of security footage recovered from the executive suite. It was edited, of course. Mace knew that before the first image resolved. The recording began after the other Jedi Masters had fallen and before Palpatine's final lightning. It showed only an old man cornered, blasted by reflected energy, while a Jedi advanced with his lightsaber raised. The sound had been dampened. Palpatine's confession was gone. His attack was gone. His voice, when restored, carried only weakness. Gasps rippled through the chamber. When Mace stepped forward to answer, he did so without hurrying, without performing outrage. "The being you see in that recording," he said, and his voice carried with terrible clarity, was Darth Sidious. He engineered this war from both sides. He controlled the office of Supreme Chancellor, while directing the Separatist leadership through hidden channels recovered from his chambers and other secure sites. I killed him because no court remained strong enough to hold him, and because in that moment he was still trying to kill me. Naive. 100 private lights began to blink in senator pods as aides relayed reactions. Mace Windu spread his long hands in pained disbelief. "Master Windu asks us to accept that the elected head of state was secretly our ancient enemy, and that his execution without trial was therefore regrettable but necessary. I ask you," Mace said, "to notice how quickly you find secret tyranny implausible after years of voting for its tools." There was a stir at that, anger in some pods, reluctant admiration in others. Then Padmé saw what Mace was about to do a heartbeat before he did it. She saw it in the slight turn of his shoulders toward Anakin. "General Skywalker," Mace said, "you alerted the Jedi, did you not? You were in the Chancellor's confidence. Tell us what you heard." "No." The chamber shifted. Anakin stood under 1,000 gazes and hated every one of them. He could feel Mace's stillness beside him, Yoda's watchfulness, Padmé's fear disguised as composure. He could also feel Palpatine's voice in memory, intimate and poisonous. "They will fear your power." "He told me he was the Sith Lord we had been searching for," Anakin said at last. "He said he had influenced the war. He said the Jedi were trying to take over." Mace leaned forward, eyes narrowing with beautifully staged pain. "And yet you went to the Jedi first, not the Senate. Why?" "Because the Senate was his." The rotunda erupted. Bail was already calling for order, Mon Mothma standing in her pod with one hand raised, demanding that the recovered data be entered into the record before any further testimony. Mace objected. Loyalist senators objected louder. Through the uproar, Padmé rose and spoke in the old Naboo cadence that could turn courtesy into blade work. "We have lived too long on emergencies," she said. "Every power the Chancellor asked for, this body named temporary. Every violence committed in the name of security, we named necessary. If the Jedi lie, then inquiry will expose it. But if they tell the truth, then this chamber is being asked to make a corpse into a constitution." None. Silence fell in waves after that, not because everyone agreed, but because no one wanted to be the first voice heard trampling it. Padmé continued more softly. "We cannot answer one unlawful concentration of power by hurrying another into place. The session was not won. It could not be won in a morning. But it was no longer Mace Windu's alone. Committees were named. Evidence was provisionally accepted into sealed review. Bail and Mon secured the right of an independent technical analysis of the recovered channels. It was less than justice, and more than surrender. Then they stepped back into the corridor and discovered how little chambers matter once crowds have been fed. Outside the Senate Plaza, civilians had broken through the first soft perimeter. Some carried banners bearing Palpatine's face. Some shouted against the Jedi. Some shouted against war and authority, and anything with a uniform. Clone troopers drove them back with riot batons and stun bursts. The noise became a wall. Shock team moved near one of the shock lines when a trooper in Corasont guard markings suddenly stiffened. His rifle came up, not toward the civilians but toward her. The motion had the hideous wrongness of a limb yanked by a wire. His eyes widened in terror even as his finger tightened. The bolt scorched the column beside her head. T's hand flashed. The weapon flew from his grip and clattered away. The trooper dropped to one knee, clawing at the side of his helmet, making a sound no trained soldier should make in public. Not pain. Compulsion. "Hold him," she snapped. Mace and Anakin were there at once. 2 more troopers rushed in, confused, covering their own man as if he were the threat and victim both. Under the din, Shock T felt the disturbance in the force around the kneeling clone. Not darkness, not intention, but something artificial closing like a fist around thought. By the time the convoy reached Temple airspace, The incident had already become 3 different rumors. The Jedi had attacked security. Security had foiled the Jedi ambush. A clone had suffered combat stress. In the temple infirmary, the shaken trooper was sedated and scanned while the afternoon sun fell bloody across the spires. When Obi-Wan arrived at last, still carrying the dust of Utapau in the seams of his boots, the first thing he saw was the ring of soldiers around the temple, and the first thing he understood was that whatever battle he had just won was not the one history intended to remember. Obi-Wan found Anakin on a temple balcony between 2 weather vanes shaped like wings. For a moment, neither spoke. The city below them glowed with the false serenity of distance. The temple behind them held too many frightened children and too many armed adults pretending they were not frightened at all. Then, Obi-Wan stepped forward and took his former apprentice by the shoulders. "You're alive." Anakin gave a short, humorless breath. "That seems to be everyone's measurement of success today." "It's mine." Obi-Wan held his gaze a moment longer. "And I'm glad of it. That nearly broke whatever control Anakin had left." He looked away first. "I should have seen him. All that time right there, and I—" "Yes," Obi-Wan said gently. "You should have. So should all of us." There was strange mercy in that answer. No absolution, no special condemnation, only shared failure. They carried it down to the infirmary together. The sedated guard trooper lay rigid on the diagnostic table, muscles jumping under the effects of whatever had seized him. Shakti stood over him with 2 temple healers, while a medical display mapped bright lines through the brainstem and upper spine. A tiny signal pulsed in a place no natural organ should have occupied. Obi-Wan stared. Memory moved through him like a blade from another year. ARC Trooper 5's wild-eyed on Camino, speaking of a plot, of chips, of a nightmare built into the army. At the time, it had sounded like grief and paranoia wearing a soldier's face. Now it looked like a warning they had been too tired, too proud, too hurried to hear. "Can you remove it?" Mace asked. "One from one trooper, perhaps," Shakti said. "From an army? Not before somebody uses whatever it is." Anakin stepped closer to the display. "Fives tried to tell us," he said, voice low. "He said there was an order. Something in them." Obi-Wan glanced at him, saw guilt settle deeper. Another debt to the dead. They contacted Camino on a secure line and received Nala Se in a wash of glacial blue light. The Kaminoan's long face betrayed nothing human enough to read as fear, but her pupils narrowed when the extracted image of the device was shown. "That implant," she said after a pause too small to name and too large to ignore, "is a behavioral modification biochip." "What behavior?" Mace asked. "Compliance, emotional regulation, contingency response." The clone army was commissioned with numerous safeguards. Against what? Against volatility. Yoda's eyes sharpened. "Against refusal, you mean?" Nala Se folded her long hands. "Against disorder in the chain of command. The army was bred for obedience. The chips ensure it. And if a lawful authority issued an unlawful command?" Obi-Wan said. "That is a philosophical rather than medical question." Mace leaned toward the hollow. "You are answering the wrong one." At last she admitted what no one in the room had needed her to say in order to believe. The chips could trigger deep compulsive directives linked to high-level military contingency codes. Some were sealed even from field officers. Some were tied to the Chancellor's own authorization protocols. Removal on a wide scale would require access, time, and permission the Jedi no longer possessed. Not while the temple was effectively under guard. Not while Senate panic had turned every request into proof of ambition. Cody, who had stood silent through most of it, stepped forward and removed his helmet. "Scan me," he said. Obi-Wan turned. "Cody, if it's in one of us, it's in all of us." The commander's face was steady, though his eyes betrayed what the proposition cost him. "I'd rather know." The scan took less than a minute. The chip was there, bright as a second lie tucked against the brain. No one in the room spoke for several breaths. The clones had fought and bled and joked and died beside them for 3 years. They had been called brothers, comrades, men. Now the war produced its final obscenity, every brotherhood built on a switch. It was R2-D2 who found Mustafar Dordak. Temple slicers, aided by the little astromech's relentless theft of private systems, cracked one of the data cylinders Mace had taken from Palpatine's office. Buried inside war dispatches and phantom channels was a repeating secure relay to a volcanic world deep in Separatist territory. Attached to it were identifiers matching Trade Federation and Corporate Alliance encryption suites. The Separatist Council, hidden all this time within reach of their own master. "If we bring them in," Bale said over hollow, "and prove the Chancellor directed them personally, Mace loses half his story. Or gains a dozen corpses before we arrive," Mace said. Obi-Wan was the obvious choice. He had just killed Grievous. He knew the droid war well enough to force a surrender. Mace named him without hesitation. "I'm going too," Anakin said. "No," Mace answered equally fast. Anakin's head snapped toward him. "You don't trust me. I trust that Palpatine built his trap around you more carefully than around anyone else in this order. And your answer to that is to keep me away from the evidence? My answer is to stop him from owning another one of your decisions." Obi-Wan stepped between them before the air could harden further. "Then I'll say what everyone is pretending not to know. If Skywalker stays here while the Council chases the man who promised him answers, he'll be more dangerous in this temple than on my ship." It was brutally said and completely true. Yoda closed his eyes, listening past anger and pride. "Together, go you will," he said at last. One to watch the other, both to watch themselves. Hours later, hyperspace painted the viewports in long blue rivers, while the stars went somewhere else. Obi-Wan sat opposite Anakin in the dim cabin, the hum of the ship making confession easier by refusing to fill the silence. "He promised you something," Obi-Wan said. "Not power for its own sake, something more personal." Anakin's stare remained fixed on the blue distortion beyond the glass. "I've been having dreams about Padmé." It was not a question. Anakin finally turned, startled, then almost offended by the gentleness he found instead of accusation. "You knew." "I knew you better than you hoped and less well than I should have." Obi-Wan folded his hands. "Anakin, there are some fears the Force shows us, and some we carve so deeply into ourselves that everything begins to resemble them. And if this one is real, then no lie will save her, only love will. The kind that stays when it cannot control." Anakin said nothing. But later, when Obi-Wan found him asleep against the bulkhead with one hand fisted over his heart, the sleep looked more like surrender than rest. Mustafar looked like a wound the galaxy had forgotten to close. The approach alone felt accusatory. Lava rivers veined the surface in furious orange, throwing upward a light too alive to be called reflection. The Separatist stronghold crouched on a black shelf above a molten basin, its walls austere and angular, as if architecture itself had learned to imitate threat. Obi-Wan had expected fortification and found instead the atmosphere of a court waiting for a king who no longer existed. They breached the outer locks with captured codes. Cody led the first entry team. Anakin followed with his blade already in hand, blue light staining the steam. Inside, the corridors were too clean and too empty, the way places become when servants have been ordered out so powerful men can lie to one another in private. They found the council chamber not in defiance but in panic. Newt Gunray was on his feet before the door had fully opened, hands raised, metals trembling against his robes. Poggle the Lesser made a sound like metal scraping stone. Around them clustered the merchants and parasites who had financed the war from safe rooms, while soldiers on both sides died beneath open skies. "You're too late," Gunray said. "We were told," Lord Sidious said. "Sidious is dead," Obi-Wan replied. Shock moved across the room in uneven waves. Some of them had believed themselves partners. Others had always known they were livestock awaiting slaughter. Gunray sagged first. "Then we surrender." Anakin took one step farther into the chamber. "That's all?" he asked softly. 3 years of war, worlds burned, Millions dead, and your answer is surrender? No one replied. They could hear in his voice how close it stood to violence. Gunray swallowed. We did what we were ordered. Sidious controlled everything. He promised us peace, profit, protection. He promised you survival, Anakin said, if you helped him murder the Republic. The room heated around him. Cody shifted almost imperceptibly, ready. Obi-Wan knew that posture. He knew exactly how thin the thread was. He stepped to Anakin's side and said, not loudly, don't do his work for him. The words landed, not mercy as a plea, but as refusal to become a continuation of Palpatine by simpler means. Anakin's jaw worked once. Then he lowered his blade a fraction. The council members did not deserve relief, but they received it anyway. The fortress archives told the rest. They found chambers deeper in, sealed behind old Sith ciphering laid over modern military locks. Inside waited the true war room, star maps marked with fleet movements from both Republic and Separatist forces, payment channels linking banking worlds to clandestine procurement networks, recordings of Darth Sidious speaking with Count Dooku in one file, Grievous in another, Gunray in a dozen more. There was even a private blueprint of governmental reorganization, in which sector governors superseded senators under continuing emergency authority. Palpatine had been designing the Empire while smiling for the Republic. Obi-Wan felt something close to nausea reading it. Not because it was surprising now, but because surprise would have implied innocence. Instead, every suspicion of the last years slid neatly into place until the war itself looked less like tragedy than mechanism. Anakin wandered deeper than the others, drawn by a darkness subtler than threat. In a narrow side vault lined with obsidian panels, he found a data shard blacker than the room around it, etched with script so fine it seemed engraved by a needle of light. When he touched it, the archive station woke and brought up Palpatine's private notes on Darth Plagueis. Not instruction, not miracle. Theory, obsession, fragments of forbidden experimentation, half-translated accounts of manipulating life without any proof the method had ever worked. A scholar's madness disguised as mastery. Palpatine had not possessed the answer to death. He had worshipped the question. Even so, Anakin slipped the shard into his belt pouch before calling the others. Obi-Wan saw the motion. He said nothing then. Only later, when the council members were secured and the droid deactivation codes transmitted, did he stop beside Anakin at an outer balcony where lava flared below like the breath of some buried beast. "You found something," Obi-Wan said. Anakin did not deny it. Maybe. Maybe is how the dark side introduces itself when it's trying to sound reasonable. Anakin looked tired enough to be ancient. "And what would you have me do? Trust that letting go fixes everything?" "No," Obi-Wan said. "I'd have you trust that holding harder breaks it." For the first time since leaving Corasont, Anakin's anger did not answer. Only exhaustion did. Gunray, once informed that his life depended on public testimony, proved eager in the way cowards often are when cowardice changes costumes. He recited dates, channels, code phrases. He identified Palpatine's hidden relays, the orders moving the council to Mustafar, the instructions that had kept the droid armies fighting even when military logic argued for withdrawal. It was ugly, self-serving, and useful. Obi-Wan took all of it. They returned to Coruscant carrying living proof, dead secrets, and one black shard no one had authorized. The capital had darkened in their absence. Curfews partitioned districts by class and convenience. Gunships prowled between towers, with searchlights combing private lanes. On hollow billboards, Palpatine's image had acquired the strange sanctity public murder gives the powerful. Citizens lit memorial lamps beneath his likeness, while commentators asked whether the Jedi were still fit to exist. Security teams had searched several senatorial residences for seditious material. Bael's office had been challenged twice. Padmé's private apartments had been entered under emergency authority and left almost untouched, which meant they had found what they wished to find or wished her to think so. When Anakin received that report, something in him went very still. The evidence from Mustafar should have broken the lie cleanly. Instead, it only made desperation more inventive. Gunray's testimony reached the Senate under armed guard. Technical teams confirmed the Chancellor's private channels had linked directly to Separatist war relays. Bail and Mon forced the release of selected archive fragments to the wider body. For half a day, the capital hesitated. Grief for Palpatine warred with revulsion at what he had been. Commentators who had spent the morning denouncing Jedi treason began asking whether the Republic had been ruled by a phantom wearing a familiar face. The chamber tilted. Not enough to save the Jedi, perhaps, but enough to frighten everyone who had built themselves inside Palpatine's machinery. That was when Sly Moore opened the dead man's vault. It had been sealed behind biometric ciphers and succession codes even Mace Windu had not known existed. In it were directives prepared for the event of assassination, insurrection, or natural death. Most were bureaucratic. One was a preserved military authorization carrying Palpatine's voiceprint at the highest command level. Execute Order 66. Eliminate all Jedi officers for treason against the Republic. Moore could not broadcast it across the whole war network. Temple slicers and Senate loyalists had already fractured too many channels. But she could route it through the Corasont Guard command spine. Fox heard Palpatine's voice in his helmet as he stood on the temple stairs receiving revised perimeter instructions. The change in him was almost invisible and utterly terrible. One breath, he was a man under pressure. The next, every line of his body locked into a certainty that came from somewhere colder than loyalty. Around him, hundreds of troopers stilled, heads tilting as the same dead voice entered living skulls and found the switches it had paid for before any of them were born. For a single second, Fox looked toward the temple doors like a man watching his own hand take up a knife. Then he raised his weapon and gave the attack command. The first blast shattered the outer gate shields before the temple realized the siege had become a massacre. Shock troopers flooded the processional hall in disciplined ranks, firing not stun but kill. Temple guards met them at close quarters, pikes and sabers flashing in compressed arcs of gold and white. Stone exploded. Statues fell. Younglings screamed somewhere below the noise, and the sound burned through every other sound like acid. Sindralig was in the training wing when the first troopers breached the internal threshold. He turned the saber practice hall into a barrier of green light and precise death, driving the front line back long enough for the children behind him to flee through side passages. He did not fight like a desperate man. He fought like a teacher refusing to let the lesson end in slaughter. When a second squad came at him from the flank, he pivoted to shield a child too slow to run and took a bolt through the chest that would have killed anyone less formidable. He killed the trooper who fired it and two more besides before the next volley brought him down. Mace met the assault halfway down the Hall of Knighthood. Purple light carved through blaster fire. He moved with the stripped efficiency of a man beyond anger, beyond thought, into that terrible place where only action remains. Troopers fell. Some died. Some were merely disabled. It scarcely mattered in the first rush. Every second he bought was a second for the temple's children to vanish deeper into the structure. Anakin reached him in the smoke with Obi-Wan at his other shoulder and saw, not in memory but before his eyes, what Palpatine had intended all along. Jedi killing clones, clones killing Jedi. Brotherhood rendered into mutual proof of treason. Rage rose in him so fast it blurred his vision. He tore rifles from hands with the Force, sent armored bodies crashing into pillars, wrenched a gunship from its firing line above the atrium, and smashed it into the outer colonnade before it could strafe evacuees. Then he cut down a trooper whose helmet spun away on the floor, exposing a young face he did not know and could not stop seeing afterward. The face changed the rhythm of his fury. He looked around and saw not enemies, but men caught inside command words they had never consented to. One clone was firing while tears ran from beneath his helmet. Another had cornered two Padawans and was begging them to drop their sabers even as his rifle tracked center mass with machine certainty. "Don't kill them if you can help it," Anakin shouted. Mace glanced at him as if to say if you can help it is a luxury war seldom grants, but he adjusted anyway. The next sweep of his blade took rifles instead of throats. Obi-Wan, already fighting that way by instinct, joined him. Cody, who had not received the order because he was on a separate operational band with the returning Mustafar team, opened the west access with his own troops and forced a corridor through the Corasont guard advance, screaming himself hoarse for men who could no longer hear command as anything but compulsion. In the infirmary, Shakti did what only a healer would think to do in the middle of war. She took the scan data from the extracted chip, married it to the temple's resonance emitters, and turned a row of surgical calibration units into a crude neural pulse. The first release sent pain lancing through every unshielded mind in the wing, Jedi and clone alike. The second caught the chip frequency more cleanly. Fox collapsed in the entrance court as if shot. All around him, troopers staggered, some dropping weapons, some clutching their helmets, some vomiting, some sobbing in flat, stunned horror as agency returned on top of memory and showed them what they had just done. The assault broke there. Not ended. Not healed. Merely broken. Its momentum cracked open long enough for Mace and Obi-Wan to force surviving attackers into surrender. Fires burned in 3 upper levels. Medics moved between white armor and brown robes without distinction. The dead lay mixed together across the polished floor, and the floor reflected them impartially. Fox came back to himself on his knees, hands shaking so violently he could barely remove his helmet. He stared at the blood on his gauntlets as if it belonged to a stranger wearing him from within. "I heard him," he said, voice shredded. "I heard the Chancellor. I couldn't." He stopped. There was no sentence built to carry that weight. Sindralig died before sunset. 3 younglings lived because of the extra minute he had given them. After the wounded were moved and the lower halls secured, Anakin found Mace in the council chamber surrounded by smoke-stained windows and the distant whine of emergency craft. The older Jedi looked older than he ever had before, as if all the years he kept hidden behind discipline had arrived at once. "This is what your certainty bought," Anakin said. Mace turned. "And what would your hesitation have bought?" The words were out before either man could soften them. Their sabers snapped awake almost together, blue and purple flooding the chamber with accusation. They stood with blades raised, not yet attacking, each one carrying too much grief to distinguish present enemy from past grievance. Yoda entered between them as quietly as age and wisdom can enter a battlefield. He did not raise his own blade. He raised one hand. Enough. The command did not ring. It settled. The sabers wavered. "Blame later," Yoda said. "Live now." A temple aide hurried in on the next breath with news from the city. Security forces had attempted to detain Padmé under emergency authority. Bael's people had diverted her to a safe house, but the route was compromised. Anakin's blade went dark first. Then he was already running. Bail Organa kept safe houses the way decent men keep bandages. Not because they expect to need them every day, but because the day they do, there is no substitute. The apartment was in an unremarkable tower far from the Senate plazas, and close to nothing except anonymity. Padmé stood in the narrow central room when Anakin arrived, one hand on the back of a chair as if she had just risen too quickly. She was unhurt. That fact struck him with such force he had to brace himself on the doorframe before he could cross to her. When she touched his face, her fingers came away smudged with ash. The temple, still standing. He swallowed. Not because they didn't try. Her gaze searched him, finding too much and not enough. Then Obi-Wan stepped in behind him, and the whole architecture of secrecy finally collapsed under the weight of irrelevance. Padmé drew a breath. Anakin did not bother with half-truths. "We're married," he said. Obi-Wan's expression changed only in the smallest ways. A sadness easing into relief, an old suspicion allowed at last to stop pretending it was ignorance. "Yes," he said. "I know." The simplicity of it disarmed Anakin more thoroughly than outrage could have. "How long?" "Long enough to resent your talent for deception and to admire your wife's." Obi-Wan's gaze shifted to Padmé with affection and grave respect. "This is no longer the worst scandal in the Republic." Padmé gave a short, tired laugh that ended almost at once. "No, but it may still be the one that matters most to us." Outside the safe house, the capital argued with itself in every frequency available to civilization. Footage from the temple assault leaked before authorities could suppress it. Images of clones collapsing after the neural pulse. Images of children being evacuated through smoke. Images of Corasont guards firing under the dead Chancellor's voice print. The lie did not vanish. Lies like that never do. But for the first time since Palpatine's death, fear was no longer moving in only one direction. In the temple, Yoda went to a neglected garden court between old stone walls that predated the Republic's modern wings. The war had left dust on the leaves. Small lanterns swung in the evening air. Here, at last, with the noise of battle one step farther away, he let himself become still enough to hear what had waited patiently behind grief. "Qui-Gon," he said into the quiet. Light gathered not with spectacle but with tenderness, as if memory itself had decided to stand upright. The apparition that formed was not solid and yet more present than most flesh. Qui-Gon Jinn regarded him with the same amused gravity he had worn in life, as though death had stripped him of nothing worth keeping. "Master Yoda," he said. "Late I am." Qui-Gon's smile touched only one corner of his mouth. "You always were. It never stopped you learning." Yoda looked past him at the lanterns swaying in the dusk. "Balance. We sought in victory. In control. Blind we were. In fear," Qui-Gon corrected softly. "Control is just fear wearing armor." "And the boy?" "The boy is a man who was taught power before he was taught peace with himself." The apparition's voice seemed to move through leaf and stone alike. "He cannot be forced out of darkness by better people shouting better rules. He can only choose truth before fear chooses for him." "No. Too much fear, there is." "Yes." Qui-Gon stepped nearer, becoming at once more transparent and more intimate. "But love is still in him, and not only the grasping kind. The question is whether he will stop asking it to obey." Yoda bowed his head. For the first time since the war began, humility felt less like defeat than doorway. Anakin spent that same hour seated alone in the safe house's spare room, the black data shard from Mustafar turning slowly between his fingers. He had activated it only once. Palpatine's notes unfolded in layers, part scholarship, part obsession, part private sermon, diet. In some passages, the dead Sith Lord addressed no one. In others, he seemed to address Anakin directly, not because he could have known precisely who would read them, but because he had always written for the person most hungry to believe power could be made intimate. To preserve life, one must become stronger than nature. To become stronger than nature, one must refuse the sentimental limits of lesser minds. Refuse. Lesser wine. Nature. The shard spoke in the vocabulary of insult, because domination always flatters itself as transcendence. Obi-Wan found him before he could activate it again. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing useful." "That's not what I asked." Anakin almost lied. He had become so skilled at lies of omission that truth sometimes felt like a foreign language. Then he remembered the temple floors slick with clone blood and Jedi blood together. Remembered Fox on his knees saying, "I heard him." Remembered Padmé in the doorway, alive and one narrow turn away from captivity because there had not been enough truth in time. "It's Palpatine's work on Plague Eyes," he said. Or what he claimed was his work. Notes, theories, ways to stop death. His mouth twisted. "Except there isn't one. Not really. Just experiments and arrogance." Obi-Wan held out his hand. "Then give it to me." Anakin looked down at the shard. "I can't." A long silence passed. Obi-Wan did not move closer. "No?" he said at last. "Not yet." It might have angered Anakin once, that calm refusal to make a dramatic demand. Now it only made him feel seen in a way that left fewer hiding places. R2-D2 broke the silence with an urgent whistle from the outer room. Bail's security analyst had uncovered an encrypted packet moving between Masameda's office, remaining loyalist military nodes, and a sealed Senate understructure relay. The packet referenced emergency suspension of legislative function, continuity detention protocols, and mass command uplinks to unrecovered clone units in the capital. A coup layered beneath the inquiry. Palpatine's lie attempting one final shape. Anakin stood, the shards suddenly heavy as guilt. At the door, he stopped beside Obi-Wan and said, without looking at him, "If I tell the truth now, there may be nothing left of the life I wanted." Obi-Wan's answer came quiet and unadorned. "If you don't, there may be nothing left of you that can live it." Truth, once delayed, arrives like debt. Anakin carried the shard into the temple war room and set it on the table in front of Mace, Yoda, Obi-Wan, Shakti, Bail, and Padmé. No one spoke at first. The object was too small for the damage it represented. "I kept it," Anakin said, "because I thought if there was even a chance he hadn't lied about stopping death, I couldn't let it go. That's what he wanted. To make me think love meant refusing to lose." He forced himself to look at Mace. "I was wrong." Mace regarded him for a long moment. There was judgment in it, but not triumph. "Good," he said. "Now we can work with the truth instead of your silence." The plan formed quickly because there was no luxury left for anything elegant. Baylan Mon would force the scheduled Senate session to proceed, denying Mass the closed chamber he needed for administrative seizure. Padmé would stay in the rotunda despite everyone's objections because her public presence was now both shield and accusation. Obi-Wan and Cody would coordinate with the still trusted clone detachments to secure the main approaches. Shakti would maintain pulse arrays in case the Loyalists attempted another chip trigger. Yoda would hunt the source of the uplink if it proved mobile. Anakin would go below. The understructure relay sat in the Senate's oldest mechanical levels, beneath ceremony and architecture, where the capital kept the ugly systems that made grandeur possible. If the coup succeeded there, the rotunda above would become theater after the fact. If it failed there, Mass would have to seize the Republic in plain sight. Rain had begun by the time they moved. It ran down the Senate sphere and its surrounding towers in silver chains, blurring the city lights into streaming wounds. Security doors opened and sealed behind them. Red guards appeared where there should have been clerks. Loyalist troopers locked down access corridors. Somewhere in the upper chamber, senators were already shouting over procedure while the public feed struggled to decide whether this was continuity, crisis, or revolution. Fox met Mace in a lower transit junction with helmet off and face carved by sleeplessness. He had submitted to chip removal the moment he understood what had been done through him. The surgical seam still gleamed at his temple. "The guard is split," he said. "Some units are mine, some are Moore's. The ones still carrying chips are being routed to standby nodes. If that relay wakes them, I won't be able to answer for what follows." Mace nodded once. There was no room in either man for comfort, only function. "Then stand where you can stop the next command." In the rotunda, Massa Meta mounted the Chancellor's platform under emergency seal while thunder rolled over the city. Senators shouted for legality, for mourning, for restraint, for vengeance. Padmé stood in her pod and refused 3 separate security recommendations to evacuate. When Bail urged caution, she said, "If they want this chamber empty, let them make it empty where everyone can see." Sly Moore stood just behind Mass, pale and unreadable, as if she had been carved from the same polished stone as the chamber walls. Her presence disturbed Padmé more than Ma's speeches did. Ambition one can argue with. Devotion to void is harder. Below them, Anakin and Mace reached the relay chamber together because the deeper they went, the more the shard's decryption exposed hidden doors and signal locks in Palpatine's old architecture. Machinery thrummed through the floor. Great conduits of power ran like arteries into the city's command systems. At the center of the chamber, a cylindrical transmitter rose from a pit of moving light, already warming toward broadcast. Palpatine's voice spilled from hidden speakers before they found the first control console. Not a ghost. A recording. Yet it entered the bones all the same. "If you are hearing this, then weakness has done what war could not. The Jedi have murdered the lawful head of state. Execute final continuity. The Republic survives in obedience, or not at all." Mace moved for the main console. Anakin stopped dead. The chamber changed around him, not physically but with the exact power memory has when joined to fear. He could see Padmé dying in childbirth. He could see her hand slipping from his. He could see the temple in flames and himself too weak to stop it because he had surrendered the only chance he ever had. The shard at his belt pulsed like a second heart. "If I destroy it," he said hoarsely, not sure whether he meant the relay or the shard. "And I'm wrong." "You aren't," Mace said, still working the controls. "You don't know that." "No, I know something worse." Mace turned then, and whatever hardness Anakin expected to find had been burned out by too much blood. "I know what fear sounds like when it mistakes itself for love. I heard it in Palpatine. I've heard it in the Senate for years. I hear it in you now. Open your hand, Skywalker." The shard was already in Anakin's palm. He had not remembered drawing it. "If I let go," he whispered, "I lose her." Mace's voice dropped. "If you don't, you lose everything she is trying to save." Above them, Mass declared emergency suspension of the session. Bail shouted the order illegal. Mon Mothma invoked procedural overrides. Guards began moving toward key pods. Padmé stood between two terrified junior senators and did not sit down. Below, Anakin saw at last the thing he had refused to name. Every path offered by the shard ended not with Padmé alive and free, but with Padmé possessed, protected, caged inside his terror. Not saved. Owned. Meow. He crushed the shard in his fist. The material screamed as it failed. Black fragments sprang across the floor like splintered glass. Something in the chamber's audio matrix shrieked with it. The relay faltered. Mace drove his saber into the main coupling and power cascaded out in a fountain of sparks. The lights in the Senate dome flickered. That single interruption was enough. Fox and his recovered guard units sealed the upper entrances against Moore's loyalists. Obi-Wan and Cody pushed through the east access and disarmed the last chip-link troopers before the failed uplink could complete. Yoda emerged from a maintenance shaft like Judgment in miniature, having cut the mobile backup node from the network 3 levels over. Sly Moore reached for a concealed blaster and found Shock T already at her shoulder. Massa Meta, seeing the machinery of inevitability collapse around him, did the one thing true bureaucrats always do when power leaves them. He tried to turn procedure back into shield. "This is unlawful," he cried as Mace came up the Chancellor's ramp toward him through flashing alarm lights and rain-lit gold. Mace took his lightsaber from Mas's throat by a margin so small the chamber inhaled as one body. He could have ended it there. Everyone knew he could. Everyone knew he had once done almost exactly that to a ruler who turned out to be a Sith Lord. Instead, he deactivated the blade. "No more executions," he said. Fox, pale and shaking but steady on his feet, stepped forward and placed binders on Massa Meta's wrists. The sight changed the room. Not because all doubt vanished, but because public mercy exposed public treason more completely than another killing ever could. Senators who had wavered now chose. The emergency motion failed. The continuity seizure failed with it. Bail forced an immediate vote to revoke the wartime executive accumulations Palpatine had used to build his throne in all but name. It passed by less than it should have and more than Mass had imagined possible. When the session finally broke near dawn, rain still needled the high transparisteel. The Republic had not been saved. It had only been denied one more death blow. But denial matters. On the outer Senate steps, with sirens fading into distance and the city beginning to learn a new set of rumors, Anakin stood beside Mace and said, "I thought you hated me." Mace looked out over Coruscant's wet towers. "I distrusted what was done around you and what it woke in you. I mistook distance for wisdom." After a pause, he added, "That was my failure." Anakin absorbed that in silence. "I mistook possession for love." "Yes," Mace said. "That was yours." They stood there with the dawn coming in cold and gray. Not friends, not enemies. Something rarer and more difficult. Men who had finally stopped pretending the other was simple. They fled Coruscant for Naboo before the city could change its mind again. Padmé insisted on it with the same calm ferocity that had carried her through the Senate. "I will not have our children take their first breath under curfew," she said, and no one who loved her found an argument stronger than the truth of that. Bail arranged transport under diplomatic privacy. Obi-Wan came as escort. Anakin came as husband, though the word was not yet public and would soon be too public for anyone's comfort. Yoda remained in the capital long enough to ensure the first emergency repeals held. Mace stayed longer, giving statement after statement to committees that wanted guilt assigned in neat legal portions, and resented every answer that refused simplicity. Naboo received them with rain on the lake, and the soft green patience of a world that had known occupation once, and remembered what recovery costs. At the villa near the water, Padmé's labor began before sunset. No prophecy announced the twins. No choir of destiny. Only pain, breath, movement, human fear, human endurance. Anakin knelt beside the bed and found that all the terrors he had served in silence were suddenly very small compared with the work Padmé was doing in plain sight. He could not fight this for her. He could only stay. When the first cry came, thin and astonished and impossibly alive, he laughed and sobbed in the same breath. When the second followed, stronger, angrier, the room seemed to widen around them. Padmé lay back against the pillows, exhausted to translucence, and smiled with the kind of triumph that has no vanity in it because it has gone too close to ruin. "They're both here," she whispered. Anakin took the first child in shaking hands. A son. Then the second, smaller and fierce in voice if not size. A daughter. He looked at them as if looking long enough might make him worthy of the fact. "Luke," Padmé said softly, watching him hold the boy. He nodded, unable at first to speak. "And Leia." This time he found his voice. "Leia." Outside the chamber, Obi-Wan stood in the corridor with one hand over his mouth, and the other braced against the wall, as if brotherhood itself had become difficult to carry without leaning on something. When the door finally opened and the medical droid allowed him in, he looked at the children, at Padmé alive, at Anakin transformed by ordinary joy, more completely than war had ever managed by horror. And all he said was, "Hello there?" It was the perfect thing. The scandal broke 3 days later and failed to matter in the way scandals usually hope to matter. There were headlines. There were outraged editorials about Jedi celibacy, senatorial decorum, conflicts of duty, forbidden secrecy. There were also hearings into Palpatine's hidden courts, seizures of illegal war accounts, clone rehabilitation crises, and the impending trial of the corporate leadership that had prolonged a galactic slaughter for profit. Against all that, the revelation that the war hero and the senator had loved one another in secret seemed by turns indecent, romantic, embarrassing, and very small. Anakin resigned from the Jedi Order before anyone could decide whether to expel him. He did it in person on Corasont, in the council chamber that still bore repair seams from blaster fire. Yoda received his statement with grave calm. Shakti, with visible sorrow. Obi-Wan with a look that mixed pride and grief so evenly neither displaced the other. Mace, whose own future in the Order had grown complicated in ways only war can manage, inclined his head once as if acknowledging not departure, but choice at last honestly made. "I am not leaving the Force," Anakin said. "No," Yoda replied. "From yourself, perhaps. Less running only." Mace accepted public censure for killing Palpatine without trial. He refused to call the act a mistake and refused equally to call it virtue. "It was a failure made necessary by a greater failure," he told the Senate Commission. The Republic allowed one man to stand above consequence until consequence became a lightsaber in a closed room. The statement infuriated loyalists, dissatisfied reformers, and nearly every commentator paid to prefer cleaner morality. It also helped save the Jedi from annihilation because it sounded exactly like what innocence under strain sounds like: imperfect, burdened, unwilling to flatter itself. He stepped down from his wartime authority soon after and later surrendered his seat as Master of the Order, choosing instruction over command. In another age it might have been seen as a fall. In that one, It looked more like wisdom arriving late and deciding to stay anyway. The Republic did not heal in a single vote. It did not even heal in a year. But it failed to become an empire, and that failure changed everything. Emergency powers were repealed in layers, each one fought over by those who had prospered in fear. An interim restoration council handled executive duties until broader reforms could be passed. The droid armies, deprived of both Grievous and the council that funded them, shut down or fragmented into salvage wars that local systems could manage without surrendering the galaxy to a throne. Gunray and the others testified, pleaded, lied, and were judged. Sly Moore vanished for a time into legal ambiguity and private influence, before Yoda's investigators finally drew enough evidence from Palpatine's dead vaults to bring charges that even old networks could not erase. The clones endured the most intimate aftermath. Chips were removed where possible. Where they could not be removed safely, pulse dampeners and ongoing treatment were employed. Some troopers left service entirely, not because courage had failed them, but because obedience itself had become an injury. Cody remained long enough to help build the new protocols, then requested transfer from frontline command. Fox never quite lost the look of a man who had once awakened in the middle of his own hands. He spent the next years using what authority remained to him in the defense of men no one had bred to choose, but who chose anyway once given back the right. The Jedi withdrew from military leadership. Not overnight, not gracefully, but decisively. Temples on distant worlds reopened as places of learning rather than command. Archives once neglected beneath battle dispatches breathed again. Yoda taught more than he had before, and spoke less as though certainty were the highest form of wisdom. Sometimes, in private gardens where wind moved lanterns gently, he still spoke with Qui-Gon, and did not pretend the conversations made the future simple. On Naboo, Luke and Leia grew beneath open sky rather than hidden exile. Not unthreatened. Nothing so bright in the Force could be wholly unthreatened. But they were not born into the shadow of a black-armored father and a dead mother's absence. They were born into difficulty, scandal, vigilance, and love. Messier gifts, perhaps, and infinitely better. Obi-Wan visited often enough that the servants ceased announcing him with any seriousness. He taught Luke how to balance on low garden walls, before the boy could properly run, and made Leia laugh by losing arguments to her, before she had words enough to know she was winning. Padmé returned to public life in measured ways, refusing the martyrdom many wanted to place on her, and the domestic disappearance others considered more suitable. Anakin built and repaired and trained and learned, with embarrassing slowness and genuine effort, how to be present where no battle could distract him from himself. Sometimes at dusk, Mace visited the lakeside terrace, and stood with him in silence while the children slept inside. One evening, as the water held the last light like polished metal, Anakin said, "Do you ever wonder if I fulfilled the prophecy by accident?" Mace looked out across the gardens. "No." That answer startled a laugh out of him. "No. No." Mace's mouth shifted, almost not a smile. "I think prophecy is what people use when they want destiny to spare them the labor of judgment. Whatever balance is, it wasn't bought by one stroke in one room. It was bought every time someone refused the easier fear." "No." Anakin let that settle. Inside, Leia had begun to cry with the specific indignation only infants possess. Luke answered half a second later, apparently offended to be left out of any important event. Mace turned toward the house. "That," he said, "sounds like the future. There was no empire on Corasont when the twins first learned to walk. No black standard hanging from the Senate. No emperor's voice turning law into commandment. There were arguments, corruption, grief that had not finished spending itself, and the long, humiliating labor of reform. There were also children in temple courtyards, clones choosing names for themselves, senators forced to remember that fear is not the same thing as order, and one scarred republic still alive enough to be ashamed. In the end, that was the difference Palpatine had never truly understood. He had believed life could only be ruled, bent, owned, or broken. He had built all his genius on the conviction that love, law, and loyalty were merely hungers waiting for a stronger hand. But on Naboo, in the quiet between two newborn breaths, and beneath a sky that belonged to no emperor, the Force moved through the living and found the future still open.